who, there we go. Welcome in particular for anyone who is new to Unrehearsed Futures. We've been going for a few years now, and it is, it's a easy, relaxed space in which to have some conversations amongst a community of practitioners and thinkers and makers. So welcome to it from your various places in the world. I hope you are all staying afloat at this time of year in your various pandemic cycles. Welcome. So just a little bit in terms of structure, the first 45 minutes of this conversation is going to be recorded. But in that time, if anyone has anything they wish to respond to, ask questions about, have something to say, please feel free to keep the chat alive. After 45 minutes, we stop recording and the conversation continues. That's just the flow of things today. And I am very pleased to welcome Nisha Abdulla, who is going to lead us in conversation today. Nisha and I met either last year or the year before. I have lost track of time. It was last year, there you go, in her work with the Indian Dramaturgy Network. And she is a director, a playwright, a dramaturg. And among the things that has really attracted me to her practice are some of the very specific terminologies that she uses to describe how you work. And in particular, and a lot of these terms are in your bio. So in particular, some of the terms that resonate with me are the term anti-oppressive arts practice as one, centering the dissenting body. And the third one that I wrote down was the listening body as a site of resistance. So what I'd like to do as a kind of introduction to you and to your practice is ask you to just begin by sharing with us how it is that you come to use the phrase anti-oppressive theatre practice in particular as a kind of entry point, and then we will see where the conversation goes. So Nisha, welcome, and over to you.
Thank you, Manya. It's quite special to be here. I've benefited greatly from this platform, both season 1 and season 2. I'm often not here live because it's an odd time for me, but I've been catching up on videos that the SM has made available. So I'm very grateful and also slightly nervous to be here, I think, because I come from a practice which is from here, there, and everywhere. I don't, I'm often asking myself this question of what is that tradition that I draw from the most, and there are so many complexities that go into my practice. So also slightly nervous to be in a space where I can talk about this. But I think that's also exciting, to be able to talk to someone from a background such as, I'm aware of some of your backgrounds, but and to also come in from a practice which is intersectional, which is drawing from multiple different traditions. So to answer your question, Manya, the anti-oppressive theatre practice as a phrase is something I arrived at because I was unpacking my own needs in the theatre ecosystem. I don't know how familiar you are with the contemporary theatre practice in urban India. A lot of it is made up of independent theatre makers. There is no institutional support or very little institutional support. The ones that exist are often private institutional support, and a lot of us are vying for that same support. So it's hard to come by. And so it's very, very fluid. It's very organic. There's a lot of banding and disbanding for projects. From the outside, it can also seem very clique-like. So this is the kind of, the nature of the ecosystem that I found myself in when I started practicing full-time in the arts. I was already in my late 20s, and was able to kind of identify things that I was very uncomfortable with, but often at the time didn't have a language, to identify or to speak of, and sometimes even no space in which to bring it up at. Often the spaces were other, young theatre makers, young aspiring theatre makers like myself. And we would often talk about some of these things that were jarring for us. Legacy behaviors, very conditioned thoughts about what theatre is, what it isn't, the boundaries, the lines, they're so clear for so many people, but while it wasn't for me. There was also a certain kind of body and experience and social background that made up the theatre ecosystem. And because of that, there were certain kinds of theatre we were seeing on stage all the time. Caste is very alive in India, even now, even in urban India. There is no place that it doesn't touch. It touches the theatre as well. There are a lot of, polarities on ideological, on the basis of ideology. So there's all of this that's very, very alive. And there I am, a woman who holds also a minority identity, and making theatre at a time in India where this is very, very inescapable for me. The kind of political regime that is at power and how it trickles down into my reality, into the reality of my loved ones, it is inescapable. And so all of this was kind of entering the room when I began to lead rooms as director. And to find the language and the space to unpack that while also, having an evolving theatre practice, that was at certain moments quite excruciating, if I'm, honest, because there weren't many journeys to look up to and learn from often. In this context, a lot of the times the learnings came from elsewhere, other theatre contexts, where political dissent and social dissent I could relate to better. Not that there is, the theatre in India is rich with dissent, but a lot of them were inaccessible to me, either because of language or location. So this very particular set of, complexities and very, very contradictory realities led to this. And in a nutshell, really, it's really about being able to come as yourself into the room. It's as simple and as complicated as it sounds. It's just to be able to come as yourself. And because in the theater, before, while I was still learning and as a performer in other directors' rooms, there were large parts of myself I had to keep outside. And so the basic tenet really is just to come as yourself. That necessarily means that there is a recognition and there is an acknowledgement of multiple needs in the room. It's not like I've been challenged with every kind of room, with every kind of need in the room. No, I'm still evolving this as I keep holding space. And this is also another articulation that now appeals to me very much, to hold space as director, as opposed to leading the room as director. It's a very important distinction for me that I've arrived at, especially in the last couple of years. This articulation, this realization, it's kind of heightened by the pandemic as well. Suddenly there was this pause, there was a forced pause, and that kind of rigmarole of production, rehearsal, research, production, rehearsal, research, that had stopped. And there was just too much to reckon with. I think post-pandemic has been a different kind of clarity. Yeah. And the rooms that I've held space for after has seen a blending in of all of this. The the curiosities which are very real for me as a mid-career theatre practitioner with an evolving practice, the curiosities that are alive for me as a minority woman in a political reality like today, someone who wants to bring those polarities into the room and find that middle, find a way to talk to both, sides, both extremes. All of that kind of became this larger, very fluid space in which I was marinating in almost. Yeah. And the dissenting body, again, to take off from this, the dissenting body then became key to the work that I was looking to create, co-create, support. Again, it draws heavily from the personal experience. I come from a social background where being in the theater is kind of unheard of. Being in the theater as a woman is kind of unheard of. And I'm also kind of entering a space where, like I was saying, there is a certain kind of experience that is given primacy to. And so to bring these realities in the form of new writing, in the form of, experimental ways of leading the audience into this experience. So then the dissenting body, became the center from which the theater making grew more into itself. Yeah.
Amazing. Sorry, I didn't cut you off. Go ahead.
No, I was just thinking of how the last time we spoke about some of this, and after that I was thinking about how I spoke about the integration, and into all of this that I'm coming in with, all of these contradictions that I'm coming in with. But it is that integration that has also allowed a certain growth into what else might be possible. And for me, that is really beautiful. It is really alive to be able to straddle both and to see the ways in which the integrating impacts the ways in which I'm able to expand into a different kind of practice, into a practice that I can say is mine. Yeah.
Amazing. Thank you. What a great beginning. I appreciate so much of what you're saying and how articulate you are about arriving at the point of really being able to, I guess, having the practice really own the terminology in a way. And I'm curious to know what, like you've given us a really rich sense of what it might look like and feel like to be in the room with you, right? On the floor with you, I should say. And I'm wondering if there's a way in which these processes under the banner of anti-oppressive arts practice appear. Is there, what do your works look like? Do they have a particular, to the extent that, this is even something that you can talk about. It's often easier for other people who've seen your work to be able to say, oh yes, these are the patterns, this is the style, that is a Nisha Abdulla piece. So I acknowledge that, but I'm interested in, I guess, also from last time we spoke, I wrote a question here that is, I wonder what the questions are to ask of a performance to know that it is doing anti-oppressive work. So I'm curious, I'm going to just let that question float, maybe for the room, if anyone wants to riff off that. But what does your work look like? How would you, what kinds of language would you use to describe it on the one post-process, I suppose?
I can see a very clear distinction between the work that, the first three productions that I did as director and the work that came post 2019. I can see that distinction. And I think I needed the first few productions to explore what I had learned from viewing, being in the room with other directors and their practices, both as performer, because I started as performer, and just to be able to sponge off other people's practices. Often I've realized, and this is something I know is not unique to only me, but I've realized that a lot of us draw and mimic until we find our own. And I can see that difference very clearly. I had a certain idea about what political feminist theater needed to be or should be, and to unlearn that and to find a confidence to say that this is not me and this is not what I'm interested in. This is what I have learned and I tried it out and I'm no longer interested in. That was itself a very sort of, very anti-oppressive lens with which to approach work. So a lot of the struggles have been in this aspect, to give myself the permission to say, this is what I'd want to do and that is not what I want to do. And that despite not having, despite all of the struggles of finding funding, all of that, there will be a way in which to do it. We will lean into community more. I was just speaking to you about fundraising for a project. So a lot of it was about giving permission to state and to articulate some of these things. For me, those have been the largest struggles. To, for example, not be weighed down by the proscenium, and to say that I will create space within community, which meant that there is a certain aesthetic and a certain limitation of form even that comes in. To realize that I'm driven by that pursuit of bringing a certain kind of theater and a certain kind of provocation into community. And it means that, some of these decisions are taken for me, and that's okay. So, from, like I was saying, 2019 I feel was a very transformational kind of year for me. From then, it's been very clear that my theater making needs to necessarily be smaller, simpler, portable. I need to be able to, have these pop-up spaces, whether it's schools, whether it's community spaces, even in the community work that I'm doing, where theater becomes a huge part around which learning happens. It's feeding into that same idea and that same aesthetic. So my first production, you will see, it was large set. I was aping an idea almost. At that time, I believed in it entirely, fully. But I was also giving in to a certain, kind of theater that I felt I had to make. And a big part of letting go of that was to let go of the idea of scale and to look at it, to look at instead the idea of impact. And that has been hugely important. So even now with the two productions that we're on the floor with now, these questions are very alive. What are the spaces that we'll be taking this to? And remember, we're in an ecosystem where one has to create these spaces. Right now, some of the most prolific directors and actors in the independent theater system are now performing in people's homes. You know, there are a lot of home performances happening. So that it is also a nature of our theater to be able to find and squeeze into these spaces, you know. So that that distinction I see now very, very, very clearly looking back. I also see increasingly a comfort with body and what each practitioner brings into the room. And that has been a very important part of the anti-oppressive practice. To look at these, this is what, you know, is in the room. This is present in the room, and we will make our theater with what is present in the room. And if it looks a certain way, it looks a certain way. If it feels a certain way, it feels a certain way. And to be okay with that, to not apologize for that, because all of us have had to struggle with the reality of wanting to make theater, to be passionately driven by it. And yet, you know, we have to have other ways in which to pay our bills, you know, live, do all of that. And I don't believe it's possible to hold on to that passion and to that purpose, you know, and then say that I want to make this kind of large scale, huge, you know, kinds of theater. It's impossible. And it's impossible. And so now it's a very ground up minimal practice. It looks a certain way, and I no longer apologize for it. The rigor and the craft remains. You know, that is open for all kinds of critiques and criticisms, and I rely on, you know, my peers there's a circle that I rely on to be able to draw that out from me. And I rely on them immensely, because as someone who does not have a sort of institutional, you know, degree, etc., I rely on that quite a bit. But it's from a very, it's a much healthier relationship now. And that's important to me. It's very important to me. Yeah, I feel like I've rambled, and I feel like I haven't answered your question.
That's wonderful. It's wonderful, Ramble. You absolutely have answered the question and more. Yeah, it's great. And I'm really, you know, just resonating with so much. And in particular, this distinction you're making between scale versus impact, and choosing impact as a, you know, the smaller, simpler, more portable, choosing that for political reasons and not just kind of expedient reasons, right? Because smaller, simpler, more portable, and the kind of agility that comes with being able to move a work around is one thing for portability, but it feels like it's another thing if it comes from a place of wanting to very consciously have more agency and autonomy of your work. And I really, I like that very much. I hear that. I hear that really strongly.
It also kind of comes from kind of integrating into the contradictions that I'm holding. Because of the contradictions that are present in my body, I'm also able to breach some bubbles. And you know, we are full, you know, all around me, we have bubbles in India. There are entire ecosystems that can live without acknowledging the other. That is very, that's a kind of a feature of Indian society. You know, there's caste and there's class and there's religious divides, there's language divides which are linked to caste and class. One can live, you know, an entire lifetime without acknowledging other bubbles. But I think those of us who are able to operate in the middles are able to take on this responsibility of of introducing, you know, one bubble to another, with the purpose of allowing some conversation, some touching, some acknowledging, just looking at each other, just acknowledging and looking at each other itself is often a big win. So that is often driving these choices.
Sure.
Yeah.
Sure. I want to invite anyone who is in the room to respond. If there's anything you want to riff off of, please do so in the chat, or otherwise, you're welcome to raise your hand as well and join the conversation with your voice. And Nisha, I want to ask you about curiosities. We spoke a lot in the prep for this call about this notion of centering curiosity. And I remember getting into that by way of the work that you're doing with young people at the moment. So I wonder if you could speak a little bit about that, like what it's looking like at the moment to do this thing of centering curiosity, and what that means, particularly now in kind of pandemic times, what the kind of resonance is that is different for this time.
So this thing of curiosity really came from working with younger people. I think it was just being present in these spaces and being able to observe and work with younger, teens and maybe sometimes even younger university students, sometimes from certain locations. This thing of the curiosity really came from being active in that space. That there is a certain ease with which another reality is kind of absorbed by younger people, which we of course lose as one grows older, one grows crankier. We lose that ability, and so to be able to go back to that sense of curiosity and to approach even, and I'm sure people can disagree on this, but to even to approach, the extreme polarities that exist politically, how does one use curiosity and not shame or rage is something that is very alive for me at the moment. And it came from the work in the community with children, especially with children from marginalized backgrounds. Sometimes it was really heartbreaking sometimes to see they had immense curiosity for the worlds outside of their ghettos, their slums. But that curiosity was also coupled with a lot of shame at their reality. And so as an educator in that space, often the task was to kind of ground into that curiosity and kind of untether the shame from that. It's often I've failed because they come with a lot of conditioning about their realities and a lot of inherited shame about their reality. So often I've failed, but in the times that I've had much longer interfacing with them and much longer work, I've seen what it can do. I've seen ways in which they're able to, declare almost that this is our reality, and we can reclaim the bits that we're not ashamed of. I see Rose's question. I'm going to take that now.
Great, go ahead.
For instance, something as simple as being able to do theater in their own language, whatever that language is, and not to do it in English, right? So to be able to own the language that is their mother tongue, their native tongue, in a context that's constantly linking English to, to higher caste, higher class, everything aspirational is English. So culturally, everything that they see around us that is aspirational is English or comes from an English speaking universe. And so one of the simplest ways in which to detether, from that shame is to be able to work in their own language and to own that language. For them to play and recognize that, theater in my language, or playing in my language, or writing expressing in my language does not mean that I'm not smart, or that I'm not worthy of other realities. Language is often something I've used. I've also used my, kind of, I think and dream and everything in English, but I have a bunch of languages that I can, fall back on, a little bit of this and a little bit of that. So often I'm meeting them in that middle, and we're often laughing at each other's, language when we're making this theater together, when we're playing together, when we're devising together. Then that curiosity about how does this sound in English versus in another language is often what we're doing. Sometimes I also use fantasy and excerpts from fantasy to be able to get them to draw out a different kind of reality for themselves. And that allows them to see that their reality is not their own making. And again, that allows that curiosity to step over the shame, right? And I suppose that's all one can hope for or aim for, that they have the tools, or they've unpacked enough of what they can claim as their own. Yeah. Thank you, Ro, for that question. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Ro, for that question. It's there's a question also from Summit that it would be great if you could take on as well. And I just want to respond quickly to some of the things you've just said, answering Ro's question, or things that have come to me, is that there's something very powerful about thinking about curiosity as only being able to exist when shame doesn't exist, and to have that as it feels like a particular tenet also, of something that might be called anti-oppressive theatre work. That if one is really going to truthfully seek to create encounters of curiosity, that the first step is to deal with aspects of shame. It also, as you were speaking, I was thinking that working with translating between languages must also be a really interesting place through which curiosity is generated, particularly if you're not trying to do literal translations. It's impossible anyway, but as soon as you're playing across languages and figuring out how to meet in the middle, it feels like that's a massively curious space, potentially. So I just wanted to say those two things and riff off you a little bit. And if you don't mind, Summit's question here, what can you see it? Yeah. Do you see body language as an important language for anti-oppressive theatre? Yeah.
I'm going to come at this a little kind of differently, although I see your question, Sumit. Just this morning, off stream, we met and we were talking about, we were ideating around a new project, and that's really about what are the politics of the body in the theater. And all of us were really sharing a lot of our own shame that we carried when we entered the theater. We were all people from some kind of marginalized identity, the three of us who were in the room this morning and talking about some of this. And all of us had carried notions of the kind of body that finds a place in the theater. One of my partners in Offstream proudly claims the Dalit identity, which is the oppressed caste identity in India, what most people know as the untouchable identity. And he shared a bunch of stories around how he's always approached for certain kinds of roles, whether it's film audition or theater. And so we were just sort of talking about a lot of that. So I kind of want to approach this a little differently. There is already, and again, hark back to what I started off with, which is there is a certain kind of body that one expects to see in on stage. And to move away from that itself is deeply liberating. For a certain kind of body with a certain kind of language, a certain kind of rhythm and intonation, a certain kind of voice, which is not this, this that I have learned, which nobody in my family probably talks like this, except because, we've been brought up to believe that anything else was shameful, and we've been colonized into speaking with this way, in this manner. Now I don't know what to do with it. But so there is all of that, even the voice, and a certain kind of voice that we speak at, a certain kind of, we often call it a certain folk aesthetic in the theater, but it's not really about a folk aesthetic. It's really about, there is a register at which we learn, we hear the voices. There is a certain kind of space that the oppressed body takes or learns to take on stage. And I think all of that is coming out of, that question that you asked, Sumit, especially in a proscenium context, when one sees theater that is not made of, an urban or a contemporary reality, we see that difference. And often I'm thinking about what that difference means in my theater, because I come from a practice, from who am I drawing from? What is this tradition that I'm drawing from? And therefore, what are those bodies that I can support on stage, and in what manner? Especially when one is working with, university age, in that age, late teens, university level, that is really alive, because often there are multiple, backgrounds of privilege bodies in the room, and there are very few bodies of, marginalized bodies in the room. And the manners in which they take up space is very, very different. And so to be able to hold that difference is something that changes with each group. Yeah.
Myrna, would you like me to take the debate further now, or shall we come back at 45 minutes later?
Absolutely, yes. Come in now, Sumit. Yes.
Okay, so Nisha, what I was really saying is, I find it strange that we're all theatre people, and yet we're shying away from body language as communication, because there's just three of us who are willing to have eye contact. I find that very, very oppressive, that there are so many theatre people who've chosen not to use body language, even if it's to affirm that, Nisha, I understand what you're saying. Okay, so
I would look at it a little differently. I would look at the platform as one that is allowing different kinds of bodies to be present in the room today. This body is able to be present with eye contact, but there are other bodies in the room today that may not be able to do that. And that's okay. I think I quite enjoy that choice.
Okay, fair enough. So
I quite enjoy that choice.
Okay.
And I think that I'm glad you brought the question up, because these are the ways these are the questions that can help unpack what is a must, what are the rules, what is theater for you and me, right? And Zoom has allowed that in ways that I think it's difficult to still in the shared space, right? Something that, Rashmi, I see your hand, but I'll just quickly answer this. A fellow theatre practitioner from Delhi shared a simple tool in a program I'm in, where he said, when someone, because they're a playback group, when they're dealing with material that's deeply personal and getting into spaces that are triggering, there is a corner in the room that is marked out and kept safe, and they move there. Now, that is something I hadn't thought of. I have other tools, but not this physical distancing tool. And it's for me, it's the equivalent of shutting off the video.
Okay.
And we need to have these, we need to question these things that we take for granted. Because the needs in the room are, highly anxious bodies. the needs in the room could be bodies that have a body memory of being singled out because of whatever reason, of being shamed, and we must make space for that.
Okay.
Thank you. Rashmi, would you like to ask your question?
This has been something I've been struggling with, so might be a little all over the place in the way I'm phrasing it. So even I resonate so much with your work, first of all, I didn't know that, and about spaces. What I think I'm struggling with are intersectional identities. Like I'm a cis woman, upper caste, upper class, but still the woman bit and the queer bit are there. And to kind of navigate that, where, probably somebody has, the only privilege they have is the male privilege, and everything else I have the privilege in, and to then not come across as over apologetic, but at the same time to be aware. It seems like a tough navigation. So just want to hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I know exactly what you mean, Rashmi. Rashmi and I operate in the same system, in the same ecosystem. We're both in Bangalore. We're both leading independent groups. One very simple tool that I use is just a tool, but it's also a practice. Is just to constantly speak the language of the I need in the room. That itself seems radical in the context that we come from, that, oh, you mean I'm allowed to have needs and I'm allowed to express it itself seems, very radical. So for bodies in the room to trust that I mean it, that when I say, please, we need to have this conversation, and that it's going to be held and it's going to be respected and acknowledged itself takes time. But I think over time, when one keeps working with, with people over projects, then that trust tends to get built. And when they see that this is not just languaging, but it's finding its way into the practice, right? So simple things like it usually comes down to the most simple things, just acknowledging what are breaks, what kind of breaks do we take in the room, what kind of scheduling do we need to do in the room, what are the different kinds of trigger points that might exist for bodies when researching or devising or playing with the material, and to keep kind of, again, which is why it's holding space and not leading. When one is leading, one doesn't have to think about these things, but when one is holding space as director, suddenly this is a lens with which I have to look at these bodies that are, sort of almost in service of this thing that we're creating together, right? So to be able to say that, I know that we have a schedule, I know that we have an itinerary, I know there is all this rigor and discipline we must bring in, but all of that sits, firmly under this need to acknowledge, whatever's coming up at this point, which is why I come as yourself, to have that space to call in other bodies in the room and say, this is my present need, we need to pause. It is really, it is liberating, even as the director in the room or as the collaborator in the room with equal states. It is really liberating to be in that space. And I want more of us, especially, Rashmi, you and I are in the same ecosystem. I want more of us to be able to, I really wish for that. We've lived in, and we've made theater in that very male, supremacist lens for far too long. And many women directors also take on that way of working. One of my friends, Karen DeMello, she's someone who was instrumental in some of the early thinkings of some of this. And yeah, she was in the room a little while ago, but I see that she's not here now. But I just wanted to acknowledge Karen, really, and the impact she's had on. So Kriti, I see your question, and I see something in the room, in the chat as well.
So before we move to both Sukriti and the chat, I think Anna had a question in there. I just want us to acknowledge it's past the 45-minute mark where we usually stop recording. So we're going to just quickly, simply do that and continue.